This is a very serious book about post-colonial Africa, economic imperialism, also football and big cocks and vodka. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any book. We'll continue our journey through the works of Ian McDonald, and it is time to finally challenge Chaga, or Evolution's Shore in the US, because clearly having different titles in different continents is a route to success, isn't it? Anyway, we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis on why you should read it, if you can find it anywhere, which, yep, you should. And then I'll have a bit of beer. You go and read the book if you found it. And then we'll do a bit of a analysis and, talk about where it fits in the larger works of Ian McDonald, what it does, how it does these things, themes, the whole 9 yards. There will be spoilers in that. So if you're, sensitive to spoilers, yeah, that's the thing. You should probably not listen to that. But otherwise, just go ahead. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here that is worth discussing. And with all of that out of the way, let's get started. All right, Chaga, or Evolution's Shore, is the first novel in a sort of series. There's at least a second novel, Kirinya, which kinda is a sequel. There's another novella called Tendelios Story, and there is a short story Towards Kilimanjaro, which I have not read. It's kind of unclear where Tendelios Story fits into that, as far as I know. I'll just follow up with Kirinya, but that's sort of where we are. It came out in 1995, and it is a science fiction story set mostly in Kenya. It follows Northern Irish journalist Gabby McCaslin on her way to Kenya to, look at an alien life form that is slowly taking over parts of Africa, and her adventures in Africa, trying to figure out what is going on there, meeting different people in Africa that have different interests in that new alien life form that is slowly devouring the countryside, and dealing with all of that kind of stuff. It is a very personal, more literary work in the way it focuses on Gabby's life and stuff, interpersonal relationships and stuff like that. But it's also obviously a big idea, science fiction story about first contact, sort of, I guess. And it's a political novel about how we in the West, or even with the United Nations, dominated by the West, are dealing with Africa, have been dealing with Africa, and dealt with Africa in the 1990s when, the HIV pandemic, epidemic, whatever you want to call it, swept through large parts of South, East, and West Africa at the time. So it's all of that wrapped into one incredibly powerful, emotional novel that is also very much about football and other stuff. It's definitely worth reading. I think it's a step up from everything McDonald wrote before in a lot of ways, moving him into the next phase of his writing. I think it's absolutely worth reading. It's very powerful, very unique in what it did at the time. This is, once again, from 1995, when, most European white middle-aged science fiction authors were not necessarily looking towards Africa when it came to setting their science fiction novels. I guess in that regard there is a sort of fictional air in the Poseidon's Children series by Alistair Reynolds. I think there are similarities mostly in the Kenya setting for parts of it, but this is very different in what it does. I would, however, say that there is possibly an influence of Chaga on what is going on with Poseidon's Children, which you also should read because it's really cool and it has elephants in space, and who doesn't want that? Once again, go read this if you can find it anywhere. I promise you it's incredibly good. It does so many things, and it manages to do all of them incredibly well. So I promise you've never read anything like this before, so go check it out if you can find it anywhere. It is worth your time, and we'll continue this discussion, obviously, in another video once I've read Kirinya. And now I'll have a bit of a beer, and you go and read that book, and then we'll talk about all the interesting bits and pieces about this specific novel. All right, so let's start with situating this in the larger works of Ian McDonald, and then we'll move on to what it does, how it does these things, and where it goes. I would argue, it kind of came out after Scissors Cut Paper Wrap Stone, and I guess technically before Sacrifice of Fools. I'm not quite sure in which order they were written. I think that, and I would argue that Chaga, or Evolution's Shore, marks the next step in McDonald's sort of like evolution, in the way he then moved forward with novels like River of Gods, Brazil, and The Dervish House, in the way that it is a more like larger, longer novel than some of the previous ones, set in a different place. Once again, in like a different country, but it mixes more elements of the literary fiction genre with it. The way it looks at very explicit, like post-colonial themes. Mixes those with technology, how it impacts specific societies. All of these elements have been there before. Like, you see that sort of coming up in Scissors Cut Paper Wrap Stone with Japan, although I guess it's kind of more difficult to call Japan a post-colonial country. It's more like a post-industrial country, but it is already sort of like hinted at in Scissors Cut Paper Wrap Stone, but that one is obviously fairly short. Compared to this one, like half the size, not even half the size, more like a third of Chaga. And it obviously also comes up in Sacrifice of Fools, being set in Northern Ireland, which is obviously also a, well, technically still a colonial country because it's still under British rule. So there is that. But moving sort of like to Africa, I think marks that next step in, or like, that change towards the next phase of Ian McDonald's work. Obviously, he didn't stay in these countries after, you know, the Dervish House. He moved on towards the Luna trilogy and his YA series that I have unfortunately not read and can't get to because Audible has region locked it somewhere in the nether. Anyway, so the point is, it marks that sort of like evolution. I think what you can see here is that some of the skills that that McDonald's used before are coming together here. So you have the more personal way of like looking at families, how they interact with each other. Those have always been there. They're clearly very strong in something like King of Morning, Queen of Day, especially in the middle part of that. The Jessica part, I think, is probably the strongest in that regard. You see definitely echoes of that family with like sisters and everything. You can see echoes of that in Gabby's family with, once again, two sisters and so forth. So he has done this before. He has obviously also looked at, you know, something that sounds vaguely African in something like The Broken Land, and he has definitely looked at like different cultures in something like Scissors Cut Paper Wrap Stone. We see all of these elements coming together in this novel. It's why I would call it like the next step, logical step in McDonald's evolution as a writer in that regard. And I think just for that, it is incredibly strong. It's like, as much as I love Scissors Cut Paper Wrap Stone, which is probably an easy introduction to Ian McDonald's, this one is like very, very much more nuanced. There's more layers to it, and the way they are like interwoven, I think, is a very shows like a confidence in McDonald's that I think was not necessarily there in the last couple of books. It also lacks like the franticness that you see in something like Out on Blue 6, and obviously also in Necroville, where maybe McDonald's did a bit too much in one go. At this point, he has reached a level of confidence that allows him to deal with all of these elements in a way that doesn't like overload the senses as much, or when it does overload the senses, it's clearly done on purpose in that regard. So once again, this is, I feel, the next logical step in that evolution. Now let's look at these different layers and what these different levels do and how they interact with each other and where that goes. So let's start with postcolonialism. Obviously, McDonald's has talked about this before, and it's definitely something that will come up again and again, which once again is probably tied to, you know, living in Northern Ireland, I guess, in a lot of ways. This book is set mostly in Kenya. It is Kenya that is slowly covered by the Chaga. There are refugees that need to be managed. There's stuff that needs to be studied. And there is a United Nations sub-organization taking care of all of that, which is where the whole idea of like economic colonialism and all these other ways that even after the supposed independence of different former colonies and states in nations in Africa, the way that the global north or the west or whatever you want to call it is still very heavily managing the affairs of this country as if we, in our Western arrogance, still don't necessarily trust them to actually handle their stuff themselves. And in that regard, I think it's very interesting to see that, like, most of the main characters that we have, Gabby McCaslin as a journalist from Northern Ireland, Dr. Shepard as an American, the main characters are still white and are there as part of that, and they can never fully actually understand it. They have to sort of interact with it, but they are still outsiders, which I think makes a lot of sense, in particular because this book is still written by, someone from Ireland and not someone from Africa. So in that regard, it is not Afrofuturism or African futurism. It is futurism about Africa, which I guess is the best you can do from that outside perspective by, reflecting that within the narrative, and also having the idea of African solutions for African problems tied into that. And so that's like the only way forward, which is obviously where the book ends with, the Chaga and the land of the 10,000 tribes, and having people deciding that this is the first time they have like the chance to actually, have their own fate in their own hands. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor in that. Once again, this is written in 1995, which is obviously also why the idea of the HIV, in this case it's called HIV-4, but like why how the HIV epidemic is tied into that, because once again, there's a really memorable passage in there when the one doctor that is doing research on the HIV-4 virus version in this case talks about how it's no longer the and she meant, once again, this is 1995 and it may read a bit rough now, it's no longer the gay plague, it's an African plague, it's an African problem and it needs an African solution. It's not about managing the symptoms from the outside, it's not about relocating or reallocating resources that could have been reallocated a long time ago to actually solve these issues, but because the West has other other priorities, Africa is basically left to deal with this on its own. And you can really read like the fury of Ian McDonald about this in the 1990s, which I mean the problem hasn't gone away and these issues have not gone away, which is why this book reads so timely in a lot of ways, right? This still reads very, very contemporary, the way we from the outside still manage those economies, exploit them in just different ways, right? We're no longer pretending to be like the brutal iron fist of colonialism with like armies and everything. Now we're doing developmental help, but it still means that we kind of get our stuff out. It also is like very observant in the way it describes the UN troops of the military, the way that UN troops in Africa, often sent by smaller countries, are there for, some UN prestige, but also highly corrupt and there to exploit people on the ground because they have the weapons, so they are corrupt, they take bribes, they actually plunder villages and so forth in this story, which is something that often happens with, troops that are supposed to manage and like large streams of refugees. It does all of that, and I think that's very powerful. But it also, it does not, and I think this is where the strength comes in, it does not show Africa, or in this case, just Kenya, as like this failed state that is just like, needs this from the outside because there's nothing going on. It shows how Kenya does, and the Kenyan society is sort of like fighting against that, is building its own sort of like existence and structures and so forth underneath that sort of like colonial economic colonial thumb in a lot of ways. You have the data pirates, like the daily data workers there. You have the different like criminal organizations that are running society and on like these networks of favors owed and so forth. They are criminal in a lot of ways, and I think that's like another part that I found really interesting. The part when McDonald in the throwaway line describes how there are these like gig workers, basically African hackers that are Kenyan hackers that are sort of like hired for like one day to do data entry stuff, because at this point in the future, well, now it's the past because it's set in 2008, but data workers IT workers in India and Bangladesh have become too expensive, so the economy has moved over to exploit people in Kenya, where they are even more desperate and the prices can be dumped even lower. And yeah, that's actually happening, isn't it? So, and these are just like throwaway lines that are made, that they make this larger tapestry. They build this larger image of how this society works, and that is really interesting. Including the fact that those IT workers are very much dressing in like cyberpunk chic, which is obviously like was a Western aesthetic and literary and so forth genre of the 1980s, but this is the 2000s, so it has sort of like become like their actual dress code and so forth to signal their occupation as being sort of like semi-legal data workers and hackers in a lot of ways, and that's really interesting. We'll circle back to that later on. So, but that's the first part. The way this is handled as a story of post-colonialism, of the way that even post-colonialism is still economic colonialism, it's still about exploitation, which obviously kind of mirrors the way that the Chaga is, hemmed in by the United Nations in order to exploit it for, well, big corporations, capitalist corporations, whereas the Chaga itself is very much not made for capitalist exploitation, but is an alternative, which we'll come back to in a moment. So, let's move on to the next big part. The next big part is, of course, the way this story is told through Gabby McCaslin and her relationships, or lack thereof, with Shepard and Faraway and the other people that she has, there. And I think what's interesting here is, and generally Ian McDonald has a lot of female point of view characters throughout his writing. He does that a lot, and not being a woman, I don't know how good he is at writing women. I think he does a credible job. I've certainly read stuff where I went like, wow, this is way more unrealistic, so I'm okay with this. What I find interesting is the way that Gabby is very much a ruthless person. She's very much someone who causes a lot of harm because she is very self-centered in a lot of ways and is going through a lot of these things. Like I recently talked about how Vikosi in Nalo Hopkinson's Blackheart Man is that kind of character that I identified with a lot. But this is a very flawed person that does a lot of things because she feels it is her right to do that, because she just does these things and does not actually think about consequences, and leaves a lot of people in her wake that are harmed, sometimes even dead, and only realize the consequences of her actions afterwards. And I think that's interesting, the way her interactions with Shepard, with his kids, with different people that she interacts with. I think the way all of this is told, I find very interesting, because this is clearly where the more like literary fiction kind of side comes in, because this story is, while all these like larger things are happening in the background, this is very much a very personal story about a woman trying to find her path, find her career, figure out what she really wants, and interacting, trying to balance her personal goals of relationships and so forth with her professional goals, and her possibly even more important spiritual goals of finally getting to the Chaga, all of these things. And that's like the main part of this story. Like the sci-fi plot, the whole Chaga thing mostly happens in the background until you reach the last third of the story. And that's a very brave and very powerful decision by Ian McDonald, because it goes counter to most narratives in science fiction that were published at the time, especially when you go further back into the past, like the golden age of your Arthur C. Clarke's, your Isaac Asimov's, and your Robert Heinlein's, and I'm mentioning them for a reason. We'll come back to that in a moment. Those stories, while being about big ideas, right? This is also a big idea book, right? Being about first contact, they usually very much neglect any form of like personal stuff, very like interpersonal relationships. That's mostly left on the sidelines, because it's mostly about discovering something and discussing the big ideas. McDonald's goes the other way around. He tells us a personal story about a woman trying to achieve her goals, and sometimes sacrificing everything that she has and more, making a lot of mistakes, buying, dealing with criminals and so forth to get ahead, and being incredibly ruthless, and then having to mostly pay at least, for the price for all of that ruthlessness. That's a very personal story, and the science fiction stuff happens in the background, but it still works. And I think that's one of the strengths of this novel, is going this opposite route. And obviously, we're in the year 2024, and at this point, there's a lot of more interpersonal science fiction out there by now. But for the time, I think it's a very brave step. And once again, we've seen bits and pieces of that before in McDonald's writing. But I feel this time around, it is very clear and very much in the forefront with, stuff like the whole football thing. And that's one of those things where I feel it's really interesting how he weaves those different layers together, right? Is that one of the ways that Gabby kind of bonds with the African or the Kenyan experience is about football, European football. I should have to say, well, obviously she's Irish, so yes. This is very much about football, being football fans. When she those small bits when she's picked up after her first excursion in the Chaga, and the borrowed clothing she gets is an AC Milan t-shirt, and she's like, gods, I can't actually record in this. I need to find someone with a Manchester United t-shirt because she's a Man U fan. But these small bits and pieces, and having a football team with the local people, having sports and stuff as a bonding thing, which has nothing to do with the rockets and everything, right? The aliens. I think that's one of those techniques that a lot of larger parts of the science fiction writing community still had to learn it, or get the confidence to include in their writing back in the 90s. It clearly has arrived big time by now, but in that regard, I think it's a clever way, because having sort of European cultural exports like football and so forth is one way that we also influence and impact and do more like a cultural colonialism in places like Kenya and other parts of the global south. So having that both as a personal connection and also as a level of cultural interaction, I think, is a very interesting way of weaving these layers together. So let's talk about the alien stuff, the sci-fi stuff. The Chaga. I mean, it starts with your typical old-time sci-fi story with, the moons of Saturn being manipulated, exploded, changed, and so forth. And then we have the Chaga. And there's something really interesting here that I think both happens within the novel and has characters say that. And that's obviously the idea that the alien needs to be truly alien. And one of these problems of a lot of first contact novels is, of course, that at some point you have to describe the aliens, and not just the alien, the other. And McDonald's doesn't do that. There's that scene when Gabby talks about the fact that she was so disappointed by the it's called Strange Encounters movie, and when the spaceship finally opens up and you actually see the aliens and how that destroys the magic of the other. And McDonald's doesn't do that. Yes, he describes part of the Chaga, but it's always this weird, large place that is all kinds of things. It is never actually truly alien, because what it does, it mirrors ourselves, and that's a very important part, because even when we describe aliens, and as those greys or greens, whatever we have, we give them humanoid features because it's still our imagination, and he just takes that idea and puts it into his world building, where the Chaga absorbs human DNA or animal DNA and so forth, and creates itself out of that as sort of a mirror, a reflection of our planet, of our world, of our experience, which I think is a really clever way of doing that. And this is where the sort of anti-capitalist stuff kind of comes in again. That human nature, that global nature, is not at its core about capitalist exploitation. It's very much not about that, which is why those groups living in the Chaga can live as they want, how they want, because there is no scarcity, there is no such thing. And the fact that the Chaga was on Earth before and has, ideas of human DNA and so forth already in its build-up shows that this has never been human nature either. This is an artificial thing, that exploitation. The outside, in this case, is not the Chaga. It's not the people living in the Chaga that are moving back into the Chaga, where they can live as they want, where they can be, queer, where they can be live in all kinds of forms of society. No, the other, the alien, at the end of the day, is the West, the capitalist West that wants to exploit this, that wants to take samples from the chaga and turn it into patents, turn it into weapons, turn it into medicine that can then be sold for money and so forth. And that sort of like inversion, I think, is what makes this book so powerful, and how it, at the end of the day, it kind of ties these different layers together, because what we see is a world that is living as alien, that lives alienated, to use that wonderful Marxist term, right? That is Africa, under the West, being exploited by the West, that is not left to actually find its own solutions. It is Gabby McCaslin who tries to actually, you know, exploit everything for her own gain, and having to figure out that that's actually really, really bad. And there is the alien that turns out to actually be much closer to our true nature. And at the end of the day, that's a very revolutionary and very powerful and hopeful, I think, message in a lot of ways. And we'll see if that kind of comes up in future novels by Ian McDonald as well. So that's the large part here. Now let's turn back to Heinlein and all of that, because I think there's another layer here, and I think that's also very important and powerful. Science fiction. This book is obviously science fiction, but it's also a book about science fiction. The way that the data cowboys and so forth are dressing like in cyberpunk fashion, which is obviously a quote from, or it's citation, whatever you want to call it, taken from science fiction. The way that so many things are named after science fiction authors, are named after science fiction characters, after, you know, all of that stuff. There's Tolkien references in there, there's Heinlein references, or Heinlein, Asimov, Clarke, and so forth references in there. It goes through all of that, and the way the whole story is about mankind reaching like the next level is very clearly also a reference to one specific Arthur C. Clarke novel, that being Childhood's End, which I think is a really good Arthur C. Clarke novel, because it at least tries to have like human characters and stuff in it. And it is about, once again, humanity reaching that next level. And spoilers for Childhood's End, which is 70 years old by now, so I feel confident. The aliens that come to usher mankind along to the next sort of evolutionary step there are described in a very clear, specific, very clear way. And when I first read it, I had to very much laugh out when they were first described. I think that it was on purpose by Clarke, but still having individual personal aliens that look the way they look in Childhood's End does clearly show the thing that McDonald's is trying to not do here by having the Chaga be something, having the Chaga be everything and not just, you know, aliens, little green men, or little, you know, or large, huge men with horns and everything. Like, it does do that. He does do all of that on purpose, and I think there's a message behind that. And I think that message is that when it comes to the future, when it comes to the indescribable, or the hard to describe, at that point science fiction offers us a language to deal with that, to play with that, to then, you know, just by making references, by referencing fantasy and science fiction as a part of literature, allows us to grapple with these concepts, allows us to actually talk about it in a way that our mere realist fictional language would not allow. And that's the power of science fiction that I think is also in this novel. And I think all of that wraps up wonderfully together, and it's just really, really good in that regard. So yeah, a really good book. I loved it. I hope you have read it. I hope you find it somewhere and can actually read it. If you have read it, let me know what you think about it. Down in the comments, I would really appreciate that. Beyond that, thanks for watching. I don't know, like, subscribe, share, do all the good things. You can join the Patreon if you feel like it. I appreciate that, but you don't have to. I'll see you very soon with another video. And until then, thanks and cheers.